Imagine this. The biggest entertainer on the planet, standing on top of a bus in New York City, holding a handmade sign that reads, "Sony kills music." Fans are screaming his name, cameras are flashing, and Michael Jackson, the man who once symbolized everything glamorous about the music industry, is now calling that same industry evil. How does a relationship fall that far? This is the story behind the Sony war, how Michael Jackson, a global icon, ended up in open conflict with the record label that controlled his music, and why he believed they were trying to own not just his songs, but his legacy. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the tabloid drama, there was something far more serious: contracts, catalogs, and billions of dollars in publishing rights. This wasn't just a celebrity meltdown. This was a business war. On one side, Sony Music, one of the most powerful corporations in entertainment history, a label with all the tools: promotion, radio, distribution, media influence, and full control over which artists rise and which ones disappear. On the other side, a man who, by the 1980s, had already broken every sales record imaginable, and who had quietly become one of the smartest businessmen in pop music. Michael Jackson didn't just sing hits, he owned hits, and some of those hits belonged to the most valuable catalog in modern music history. This war would ask some uncomfortable questions. Who really owns art once it's been sold? How much control should a label have over the artist who created the music? And what happens when that artist tries to fight back? Because long before artists like Taylor Swift started re-recording their masters, long before social media gave musicians a platform to call out labels, Michael Jackson was already standing alone in front of the cameras, accusing his own company of sabotage, racism, and corporate greed. Was he right? Was he exaggerating? Or was he simply one of the first major artists to publicly expose how the music business really works? In this documentary, we'll dive into the deals, the contracts, the protests, and the power plays. We'll see how a young performer with no control over his own songs became one of the strongest music rights owners in the world, and why that power may have painted a target on his back. This is not just a story about Michael Jackson versus Sony. It's a story about control, about money, about ownership, and about what happens when one artist becomes too powerful in an industry built on keeping artists in their place. This is the Sony war. How MJ fought the label controlling his music. To understand the war between Michael Jackson and Sony, we first need to understand how it all began, and how Michael, a performer who started with no control over his own work, slowly became one of the most powerful rights holders in the music world. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, young Michael was part of the Jackson 5, signed to Motown Records. The group had hit after hit. I Want You Back, ABC, I'll Be There, but the boys didn't own those songs, and they certainly didn't own their masters. Like many young black artists of that era, they were the faces and the voices, not the owners. When the Jacksons left Motown and moved to Epic Records, which would later become part of CBS Records, eventually acquired by Sony, things began to change. In the late 1970s, Michael launched his solo career under Epic, and with albums like Off the Wall and later Thriller, a probed that wasn't just a performer, he was also a songwriter. Songs like Billie Jean and Beat It carried his name in the credits. That meant publishing money. That meant leverage, but even in the masters. The original recordings belonged to the label. Behind the scenes, Michael was watching, learning. He studied music publishing, the quiet, often invisible side of the business where the real money is made. Licensing songs for films, commercials, radio, and cover versions. He had advisors, lawyers, and mentors who helped him see that the true power in music isn't just in performing the songs, it's in owning them. Then, in 1985, Michael Jackson made a move that would change everything. At just 27 years old, he outbid competitors, including Paul McCartney's own team, to purchase a TV music publishing for around $47.5 million. That catalog included over 250 Lennon-McCartney compositions, the heart of the Beatles songbook, along with hundreds of other titles. People called him crazy. They said he'd overpaid. They didn't see what he saw. Michael now owned not just his own songs, but the rights to some of the most valuable music ever written. Every time a Beatles song played in a commercial, a movie, or was covered by another artist, money flowed into a TV. And a TV belonged to him. Meanwhile, CBS Records was acquired by Sony Corporation in 1988 and rebranded as Sony Music Entertainment in 1991. Michael Jackson was now recording for a Japanese electronics giant with deep pockets and aggressive global ambitions. In 1991, he signed a record-breaking deal with Sony Music, reportedly worth over $60 million, making him one of the highest-paid artists in history. Then, in 1995, came a strategic move that would bind Michael and Sony together even more tightly. The merger of ATV Music with Sony's own publishing division. The result was Sony ATV Music Publishing, a joint venture in which Michael Jackson owned 50%. Sony reportedly paid him $90 million up front as part of the deal. To the outside world, it looked like a win-win. Michael got a huge payout and a powerful corporate partner to help grow the catalog. Sony gained access to the Beatles' songs and Michael's sharp business instincts, all while solidifying their relationship with their most profitable artist. But hidden inside that partnership were clauses and conditions that would later become weapons to finance his lifestyle, his projects, and new investments. Michael took loans using his share in Sony ATV as collateral. Around 2001, he secured approximately $200 million in loans from Bank of America, backed by his stake in the catalog. The catalog was so valuable that banks were happy to lend. But that also meant one thing. If he couldn't pay those loans back, someone else, potentially Sony, could end up with more control. There were also reported provisions that allowed Sony to buy a bigger share of the catalog under certain circumstances, especially if Michael defaulted or chose to sell. On paper, it was smart business. In practice, it created a dangerous imbalance of power. By the mid-1990s, Michael Jackson was both Sony's biggest recording artist and Hafona of a publishing company that held the keys to some of the world's most valuable songs. It was an unprecedented position for a performer, especially a black artist who had grown up in a system that almost never let artists own anything. Album budgets ballooned. Industry tastes changed, and the pressure for profits increased. Sony saw an expensive superstar with declining sales. Michael saw a corporation that owed much of its wealth to his talent and his business moves. The partnership that once looked like a dream alliance between artist and label was beginning to look more like a trap. By the late 1990s, the music industry was changing fast. Hip-hop and R&B dominated the charts, teen pop acts were rising, and a new digital revolution, file sharing and piracy, was shaking the foundations of major labels like Sony. In the middle of that storm, Michael Jackson was preparing what would become his last studio album of new material released during his lifetime, Invincible. Recording Invincible was a long, expensive process. Michael was a perfectionist, and the sessions stretched over several years. Producers, engineers, songwriters, some of the biggest names in the business rotated through the studio. Reports suggest that the album's production costs alone reached around $30 million, making it one of the most expensive albums ever recorded. For Sony, that was a serious risk. When Invincible was finally released in October 2001, it debuted at #1 in multiple countries and sold over 2 million copies in the United States alone within weeks. Worldwide, it moved over 6 million units in its first year. By normal standards, it was a success, but Sony had expected, or at least hoped for, another thriller. And, in an industry already feeling financial pressure, very successful wasn't enough to justify insanely expensive. This is where narratives start to clash. Michael Jackson believed that Sony deliberately underpromoted Invincible. He complained publicly that the label refused to fund more music videos beyond the initial singles, wouldn't push additional radio releases, and provided insufficient touring support. He felt that songs with massive potential, like Unbreakable or Threatened, were given a fair chance. He claimed that after the first promotional push, Sony essentially abandoned the project. From his perspective, this was sabotage. Why would a label sabotage its own star? Michael had a theory. He believed Sony wanted to push him into financial distress, forcing him to sell his share of Sony TV or default on loans connected to the catalog. According to him, if his income dropped and he couldn't meet his obligations, Sony could step in, acquire more ownership, and finally control the entire catalog, including the Beatles songs he had bought back in 1985. To Michael, the math was simple. If Sony promoted him less, his sales would fall. If his sales fell, his financial pressure would grow. And when he was vulnerable, Sony would make its move. Sony, on the other hand, denied any such plan. From the label's point of view, the album's promotion was affected by many factors: changing radio trends, shifting public taste, Michael's complicated public image, and the massive global impact of the September 11th attacks, which happened just weeks before Invincible was released. The company stated it invested over $25 million in promotion and marketing, though Michael's camp disputed those figures. But whether by design or by circumstance, the result was the same. Michael felt betrayed. He also believed that a key figure inside Sony was personally targeting him: Tommy Mottola, the powerful chairman of Sony Music. Mottola had a reputation as a tough, sometimes ruthless executive, the kind of man who could make or break careers with a phone call. Michael began to view him not just as a businessman, but as an adversary. Behind closed doors, the tension between artist and label intensified. Michael saw unpaid royalties, stalled negotiations, and what he interpreted as threats related to his catalog. Sony saw an increasingly unpredictable superstar, huge costs, and a shrinking return on investment. Michael's debts were growing. By the early 2000s, reports suggested he owed over $270 million to various creditors. Much of his wealth was tied up in illiquid assets: Neverland Ranch, art, and especially his stake in Sony ATV. To free up cash, he had to borrow, and to borrow, he used his catalog as collateral, tightening the chain that connected him to Sony and to the banking system. By 2001 and 2002, rumors swirled in the press. How much did Michael really owe? Was he close to losing his stake in the catalog? Could Sony step in and buy it at a discount? No one outside the inner circle knew the exact numbers, but Michael believed he knew the intention. In his mind, this wasn't just a bad business relationship. It was a setup. He began to see a pattern. Powerful companies using complicated legal and financial tools to quietly transfer ownership away from the artists who created the value in the first place. To him, it echoed the experiences of earlier black musicians who had been systematically stripped of their rights, but now on a larger, more sophisticated corporate scale. Invincible became more than an album. It became the symbol of a bigger question: who was really in control of Michael Jackson's career? Michael himself, or the corporation behind him? The answer, for Michael, was clear, and he was about to take that answer public. In 2002, the conflict between Michael Jackson and Sony burst into the open. No more quiet negotiations. No more private letters. Michael decided to take his war to the streets and to the cameras. In July 2002, Michael appeared at fan rallies and press events in London and New York, not as the flawless, carefully packaged superstar the world was used to, but as a furious, outspoken critic of his own label. Surrounded by fans holding signs like "Sony sucks" and "Boycott Sony," Michael grabbed the microphone and unleashed his accusations. He called Tommy Mottola the devil. He described Sony as a racist, exploitative company that had a long history of taking advantage of black artists. He said that they had intentionally sabotaged Invincible, that they were trying to destroy his career, and that the ultimate goal was to steal his catalog. He even appeared at Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network headquarters in Harlem, making his case in front of civil rights activists. For many fans, seeing Michael speak this way was shocking. This was the man who had once been the face of MTV, who had been the centerpiece of Pepsi commercials and global brand partnerships. Now he was standing in public, dressed in simple clothes, holding protest signs, accusing his own corporate partners of corruption and evil. Sony denied his claims. Executives and insiders painted a different picture: a struggling music market, a superstar artist with massive expenses, and an album that simply didn't perform relative to its cost. Some industry figures dismissed Michael's accusations as paranoia or the result of bad advice from people around him. Tommy Mottola himself later addressed the situation in his autobiography, denying racism and claiming the label did everything it could to support Michael. The truth was likely somewhere in between. What is clear is this: Michael Jackson was one of the few artists who truly understood the power of owning publishing rights. He had seen firsthand how much money a catalog like Sony TV could generate. He also knew that labels and publishers, once they gain control of assets, almost never give them back. At the same time, his financial structure was fragile. The loans he had taken, tied to the catalog, meant that if anything went wrong, if revenue dipped, if deals fell through, he could lose leverage quickly. That vulnerability made his position both powerful and precarious. By publicly attacking Sony, Michael was taking a massive risk. Major labels don't usually tolerate open rebellion from their flagship artists. But he felt he had no choice. For him, this was about more than one album. It was about his life's work, his ownership, and, as he framed it, the future of artists everywhere. After the protests and public speeches, the relationship between Michael and Sony as a recording artist effectively collapsed. His contract with Sony expired, and no new studio album would be released through the label during his lifetime. However, the financial entanglement with Sony TV remained. In 2006, facing mounting debt and the threat of foreclosure on his loans, Michael Jackson entered into a complex refinancing agreement worth approximately $325 million with Fortress Investments. As part of this deal, there were provisions that would allow Sony to eventually increase its stake in Sony TV if certain conditions were met. Michael managed to avoid losing his share entirely, but the clock was ticking. Then, on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died suddenly at the age of 50. After his death, his estate, managed by executors John Branca and John McClain, began aggressively paying down debts and renegotiating deals. In 2016, 7 years after Michael's death, the estate sold his remaining 50% stake in Sony ATV Music Publishing to Sony Corporation for $750 million. The catalog Michael had fought so hard to protect was now entirely in Sony's hands. The irony was not lost on fans and industry observers. Whether through calculated corporate strategy or simply the inevitable outcome of financial pressure, Sony ended up with exactly what Michael had feared they wanted: full control of the most valuable music publishing catalog in the world. Michael Jackson's war with Sony was never really about one album or one executive. It was about power, ownership, and who controls the art after it's created. His fight raised questions the industry still grapples with today. Should artists own their masters? Can corporations be trusted to act in artists' best interests? And what happens when business relationships become battles for survival? Michael may have lost the catalog in the end, but his willingness to fight publicly, to call out the system, and to demand respect for artist ownership helped pave the way for future generations of musicians who refuse to be controlled. The Sony war is over, but the questions it raised will never go away. So, what do you think? Was Michael Jackson right to go to war with Sony? Was the label really trying to sabotage his career and steal his catalog? Or was this a tragic case of financial mismanagement and bad timing? Looking back now, knowing that Sony eventually ended up with full ownership of the catalog after Michael's death, it's hard not to wonder. Could he have done anything differently? Should he have sold earlier and walked away? Or was fighting publicly the only way to expose what was really happening behind closed doors? And what about today's artists? We're seeing more musicians take control of their masters, re-record their albums, and speak out against unfair label practices. Michael Jackson was doing this over 20 years ago, often alone, often misunderstood. Do you think he was ahead of his time? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you believe Michael was sabotaged? Or do you think the conflict was more complicated than that? And if you were in his position, what would you have done? If you found this documentary eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the untold stories behind the music industry. We're pulling back the curtain on the business, the power, and the battles that shaped the legends you love. Thanks for watching. This is the Sony War. And the fight for artist ownership is far from over.